Hello and welcome to ProfDale's Property video number 13. In this video, we're going to do a review of estates in land and future interests. That's all the material covered in videos 5 through 12. And here we're going to try to put them all together and show you a way of organizing them in your mind and approaching them on an examination or when you're asked a question about them. Before we look at the flowchart that shows the process of analysis for estates in land and future interests, let's look at some important facts that we need to keep in mind. The first one is that usually a deed or a will contain multiple interests, perhaps some present and some future, and each of those interests has to be analyzed separately. That means that the first task you have is to go through the conveyance and identify what each interest is. To fully specify a future interest, we have to state two things about it. We have to state both the type of future interest that it is and also the type of estate that it will be if and when it becomes possessory. Let's take a look at an example that will illustrate these two principles. The example says that O, the owner, conveys to A for life, then to B for life, then to B's children. Let's assume that B has one child at the time of the conveyance. Well, we need to identify each interest. The first interest is A, and A has a present possessory life estate. The next interest is B, and B also has a life estate, but it's not a present possessory interest because it doesn't take possession until A dies. So what B has is a vested remainder for life. We know that it's a vested remainder because B is an ascertainable person, we know his name, and there are no conditions precedent or precedent to B's taking the property. The third interest is the one to B's children, and it's also obviously a future interest. In this case, because B has one child already born, it's a vested remainder. But it's a vested remainder in fee simple absolute, which means that when B's children get it, they get to keep it forever. However, because it's a class gift, it's a gift to a group of people described by their relationship, namely B's children, it is subject to partial defeasance or subject to open. What that means is that B could have more children in the future, and those additional children would be permitted to take their shares of the remainder as well. Now you'll notice that if B didn't have any children when this gift was given, when the conveyance was made, then this wouldn't be a vested remainder subject to defeasance at all. It would be a contingent remainder because there would be no ascertainable takers of it if B didn't have any children yet. But because B has a child, it's a vested remainder subject to partial defeasance or subject to open. Now let's take a look at the flowchart that gives us an overall process for analyzing estates and future interests in land. The first thing we need to do, as we said on the previous slide, is to identify each interest in the conveyance and determine if it's a present or a future interest. Now that's normally perfectly easy to do, but we need to do it for each individual interest, and then we need to follow the flowchart through for each of those interests. So if it happens that the interest we're looking at is a present interest, then all we need to do is determine what type of estate is being conveyed. It might be a fee simple absolute, a fee simple defeasible, it might be a life estate, it might be a fixed term leasehold estate, etc. We did the chart, you remember back in video number 5, that shows all of the estates in land. So all we need to do is determine under that chart what type of estate we're looking at, and we're finished. We've done all we need to do if it's a present interest. On the other hand, if the interest we're looking at is a future interest, then we need to ask ourselves the question, is that future interest created in the grantor or in a third party? Because that will help us classify the future interest. If the interest is created in a grantor, it has to be one of three kinds, and we need to determine then whether it's a possibility of reverter, a right of entry, power of termination, or a reversion. Once we've done that, again, we're done. We've said all we need to say about the future interest, except, of course, to say whether it is in fee simple absolute or for life or something else about how long it will last once it becomes possessory. On the other hand, If the future interest we're looking at is created in a third party, someone other than the grantor, then we have to determine whether it's a remainder or an executory interest. We do that by applying the rules for remainders. If it satisfies all four of the rules for remainders, which we covered in one of our previous videos, then it's a remainder. If it breaks even one of those rules, then it isn't a remainder, and it must instead be an executory interest. Once we've decided whether it's a remainder or an executory interest, we say, all right, if it's a remainder, we have to decide if it's a vested remainder or a contingent remainder, and we also need to identify whether or not it is a class gift. A class gift, you remember, can be a vested remainder as long as it is subject to partial defeasance. In other words, so that more members can be added to the class, the shares of the original members can be cut down. So we need to decide if it's vested or contingent as a remainder, and also whether it's a class gift or not. If it is a vested remainder and it's not a class gift, we're finished. We've said all we need to say about it. On the other hand, if it is a contingent remainder or it's a class gift, then we need to apply the rule against perpetuities to it. Likewise, if it's an executory interest, we need to apply the rule against perpetuities to it. Once we're finished applying the rule against perpetuities, we can decide whether the particular future interest is valid or void, and then we are done. So that's an overall process for analyzing estates and future interests. It's a wonderful thing to have that memorized and be able to use it. That completes our discussion of estates in land and future interests, found in videos 5 through 13. Our next two videos will cover two topics closely related to estates in land and future interests. Video 14 will cover restraints on alienation, and video 15 will cover the law of waste. If you have questions or comments, email ProfDale01@gmail.com, and thanks for watching.